Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the second day of our week of action. We are really excited to have you all here with us, and welcome back to those who joined us yesterday for our Food Security Day of Action. And if you're joining us for the first time today, we are glad that you are here to jump in for our Criminal Justice Day of Action. So just a little bit of introduction. If you are new to Empower Missouri, I'm going to go ahead and present my slides here. So for those of you who are new to us, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us. Empower Missouri is a statewide advocacy organization that works on basic human needs and equal justice for every person in our state through coalition building and advocacy. So we convene 4 statewide coalitions: a Food Security Coalition, a Criminal Justice Coalition, an Affordable Housing Coalition, and an HIV Justice Coalition. And our week of action this week is centered on each one of those coalitions. Each coalition has a day, and we are really excited to have you with us to learn a little bit more about our work and some of the key legislation that we are pushing in the last 4 weeks of the legislative session here in Missouri. For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Mallory Rush. I am the relatively new executive director here at Empower. I joined staff in December, so I've been around just about 4 months. I'm based out of St. Louis, where I was born and raised, and where I've been working in nonprofit leadership for the last 15 years. So really thrilled to join the team, and really thrilled to be with you today as the facilitator for this criminal justice piece of our work. I started my career working in criminal justice at the Center for Women in Transition in St. Louis. And so it's been really great to get back to those roots and to get to do a little bit of that work here at Empower. So just to give you a quick agenda for the day, so just want to give sort of a quick overview of where our series has been and where it is going later this week. And then each one of our sessions this week will have a skill building piece and then a legislation specific piece. So our skill building piece today is a quick reminder of how a bill becomes a law. I think that's one of those things where maybe we saw a Schoolhouse Rock episode about it 20 years ago, but I know that really until I came into this position and started spending time in the Capitol building on a weekly basis, some parts of it were a little bit fuzzy to me. So it's good to do a bit of a reminder of exactly the process that legislation takes from inception into implementation. And then, of course, today we'll be talking about criminal justice reform and HB 316. And then at the end of this call, we will be taking a few minutes to take some action together as a group. My wonderful team is all on the call. So thanks to Sarah and Christine and Rico for being here. Sarah and Christine, I know, are helping to monitor the chat. So please don't hesitate to interrupt if you have questions. Help me to see things so that we don't miss anyone. So very quickly, just thinking about our our week of action. So since we are going to do the skill building piece every day, just wanted to do a quick revisit of yesterday's piece and then tell you what's coming up ahead in case you'd like to join us tomorrow or Thursday. So our skill building piece yesterday was really around how do you take an area of passion and translate that into an area of advocacy. So the wonderful Christine Woody on our team took some time to help people really think through, how do you think through what your areas of passion are and how do you translate that into sort of a personal advocacy agenda. So if you missed that and you want to learn more, go back. Our recordings are up on the website, so you can check out yesterday's session. And then moving ahead, tomorrow's session is going to be facilitated by Sarah Owsley. She'll be talking, of course, about our affordable housing work, but she'll also be helping people think through how do we really get in touch with legislators and how do we build a relationship with legislators over time? How do you make a good connection so that folks know to come to you again and again for information and expertise? And then on Thursday, Drew Shent of the HIV Justice Coalition will be facilitating our call. He's been one of the key leaders of the HIV Justice Coalition and is going to be talking about how coalition building is really key to long-term success in advocacy. So you won't want to miss that either. But as I said, today's session is really going to be about criminal justice reform and thinking, and a quick reminder on how bills become laws. But I wanted to start by centering us on a quote as we think about why criminal justice reform matters. So this quote is from a woman named Susan Burton, who runs an organization called A New Way of Life. It's a reentry program, since we are really going to be focused on reentry today. So she writes, mass incarceration is a symptom of a larger problem, which I call America's isms. Classism, racism, and capitalism are the driving forces behind our broken justice system. So I just wanted to take a moment to center ourselves in that intention for this hour and why criminal justice reform is so incredibly important in the state of Missouri. But before we return to talking more specifically about the criminal justice system, wanted to take a few moments to go through some of our sort of Missouri Legislature 101 basics. So as a quick reminder, the Missouri Legislature is made up of 197 members in both the Senate and the House. So the House is the larger chamber. It has 163 members. Members of the Missouri House of Representatives are elected to 2-year terms. So they have a max of 4 terms that they can serve for a total of 8 years. The Senate is much stronger and much more powerful. So the Missouri Senate is made up of just 34 members. They serve 4-year terms and have a 2-year max. And on an annual basis, the Missouri Legislature meets from January until May. So we are nearing the end, T-minus 4 weeks until the legislature breaks for the summer. So how is it that legislation is able to be filed with the Missouri Legislature for consideration? There are a few different ways that legislation is created and then gets into the hands of our legislators. 3 sort of common pathways that bills take. One is that there are pieces of model legislation that exist. So when there is a state that has really gotten something right, that has made a change that has had a really good impact on communities, it's often turned into what we call model legislation. And those pieces of legislation are held up by reformers and coalitions and national organizations across the country, and they are passed from state to state so that each state can sort of learn about what those legislative reforms look like and then find a way to either file that model legislation as it is, or to make changes that make it work for their own state. So our Missouri HIV Justice Coalition is a really good example of a coalition that has used model legislation to design our reforms for HIV criminalization law. There have been many, many states who are working on this issue across the country, and there are national organizations that have come up with model legislation for modernizing HIV laws that are then shared between states, worked on, and then shared back with the coalition so that we're all learning from each other. So that's one way that legislation is sort of crafted and filed. Oftentimes we just see legislation that's crafted by lawmakers. So most often what you will see is not new, sort of like a brand new section of state law, but a modification to existing state law. So almost any kind of legislation that you're going to see is asking to remove this line of state law or remove this paragraph of state law and then put in a new piece of legislation in its place. And so often we see lawmakers really doing that sort of work, examining the current law, working with lawyers, working with folks that they know to be able to rewrite sections of the law that they want to change, either because it's outdated or because there's been some other change more broadly in the community that means that our legislation needs to change. And then our favorite way that legislation is created is when it's crafted by communities. So when community organizations, individuals in communities, affected populations really are seeing, hey, this piece of the law isn't working for us. It would really be better if instead of this X provision, we had Y provision. And that sort of legislation can be proposed then to legislators who are willing to sort of work with community members to craft that legislation together and then file it on behalf of the partners that they work with. So each year, the Missouri legislature opens what they call pre-filing of legislation on December 1st. So even though the session doesn't start until January, there's about a month or 5 weeks where legislators can go ahead and begin filing their legislation so that the rest of the legislature and that folks across the state can know what they are intending to work on in the coming session. And then bills can continue to be filed through the 60th day of the session, which is typically in early March. And then they close down legislative filing and say, we filed all the legislation we're going to work on. We're going to take the second half of the session and really just work on the legislation that has been filed. Once a piece of legislation has been filed, it's filed by either a representative or a senator in the chamber for which they serve. So all legislation starts out in one side of the legislature, one chamber. So once the legislation has been filed, it's then introduced. So it has a first reading and then a second reading on the House floor, giving everyone an opportunity, all of the legislators, the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the proposed legislation. And then upon the second reading, the chair of each of those bodies has the ability to assign the legislation to a committee. So there are many, many, many committees, many more on the House than in the Senate, but several dozen committees across the legislature, which are small groups of legislators that have been appointed to serve, likely because they have some sort of expertise in that area, either professionally, or it's something that if they've been in the legislature for a while, maybe they've been specializing on it. Maybe it's part of the platform that they originally ran on. If there's someone who's really invested, say, in healthcare issues across the state, they may ask to be assigned to health committees. So, you're really working with people that have a certain level of passion and knowledge in that area. So once the legislation is assigned to a committee, it can sit in committee forever. Sometimes we see legislation that's assigned to committee that never gets a hearing. It just sort of is assigned there and then sits there. But in an ideal world, once you are assigned to a committee, then the piece of legislation receives a hearing. And so that's really sort of our first avenue as public advocates to be able to provide feedback on legislation. So the dates of the committee hearings are public. Those hearings are always open to the public to be able to come in and share thoughts and feedback. Testimony can be submitted online through portals that exist on the legislature's website. And then the people are always welcome to come to the Capitol building and provide testimony on bills. So the way that those hearings normally go is that the legislature sorry, I was just reading a couple of things in the chat. My apologies. Thinking they were questions, but they're not questions. Y'all are just figuring out the link situation. So the legislature has a hearing and the bill sponsor gets to speak first. They get to introduce their legislation to the committee and provide context on why they are hoping to pass the legislation. The individual lawmakers who sit on the committee are then able to ask questions of the bill sponsor, and then the public has the chance to testify. So they typically first hear folks who are in favor of the bill, then they hear folks that are opposed to the bill, and then they hear testimony from folks who are just there to provide general information. So a lot of times those will be state employees that will come in and just say, hey, this is how this bill will affect the way that this piece of the state government operates. Then lawmakers take all of that information into consideration, and the committee will schedule an executive committee session and vote. So they'll come back to that legislation, usually within a week or two, debate everything they've heard. Sometimes amendments will be drafted at that point, or committee substitutes will be drafted at that point. The legislation might be changed a little bit, and ultimately the committee will decide whether or not they want to pass the bill out of committee. If they do pass the bill out of committee, then it will ultimately go to the floor of either the House or the Senate, wherever it was heard first, to be debated on the floor. It will get a vote on the full floor of that chamber. And if it passes that chamber, then it has to go to the other side of the legislature and basically start over. So it goes back sort of to the second section here. It has another first reading, a second reading. It's assigned to committee. It gets another committee hearing on that side, another chance for public testimony, which a bill can really change from the time it was originally introduced and heard testimony. So it's very often the case that folks want to come back and give testimony, either similar testimony to the original bill or have it be tweaked based on the way that the bill has changed. There'll be another executive committee hearing and then a floor debate on the other side. And if substantial changes are made in the second chamber where it's heard, if amendments are added, et cetera, then it has to go back to the original chamber, back to the floor, and be debated on and voted on again. So once both of the chambers have agreed to the same piece of legislation and voted it out on the floor, then it goes to the governor for his signature. And that is why, while we file many pieces, over 1,000 pieces of legislation are filed every year in Missouri, usually close to 2,000 actually. Very few are actually passed every year. Typically less than 100 pieces of legislation are actually passed because there is so much back and forth that has to happen in order for both chambers of the government to agree on a piece of legislation. Any questions on sort of our quick reminder here of how a bill becomes a law in Missouri? Okay. So now we'll get into talking a little bit about specifically about criminal justice reform, which is our topic for the day. So criminal justice reform is an incredibly broad area of work. And while today we're going to specifically be talking about a reform related to reentry, I just wanted to make sure that everyone started with sort of a full understanding of the universe of criminal justice reform that we work on here at Empower Missouri. So criminal justice reform really starts in thinking about policing reforms, right? So how do police interact with the community? How are we lessening discrimination in policing? How are we making sure that police are really doing their job to protect and serve all community members? The next area of reform that we work on is smart sentencing. So once someone has been arrested, how are we ensuring that their rights are really held up during the proceedings that they go through with our judiciary system? So how are we making sure that they are treated fairly if they are being held in pretrial incarceration? How are we advocating for fair bail to be sent so that folks are not being held pretrial unnecessarily? One of the things we work on a lot in the criminal justice space is really making sure that people are not being held pretrial just because they're poor. It's not a crime to be poor, and so making sure that folks who don't need to be held pretrial for public safety reasons are able to continue their lives as they are innocent until proven guilty. And then if someone is found to be guilty of a crime during their trial, how are we advocating to make sure that people are receiving a fair sentence and not receiving sentences that are disproportionate to the crimes that they have committed? The third area, then, once someone has received a prison sentence and is being incarcerated, is ensuring that our incarceration system is restorative and not punitive. So, the current director of the Department of Corrections, Ann Presythe, has said in the past that it's the Department of Corrections, not the Department of Punishment. And we really appreciate that standpoint. We really appreciate the perspective that, folks really should be there to have a chance to learn from their mistakes and to make different choices when they're removed. And that includes, making sure that folks have access to education, job training. Many people who are incarcerated in the state of Missouri are incarcerated because of substance abuse issues. So making sure that there are good substance abuse programs in prison so that when people are coming out, they're not continuing to struggle with issues of addiction. And making sure that people are prepared when they are leaving the justice system to be successful. And then that brings us to our sort of fourth area of criminal justice reform in Missouri, and that is reentry. We have a system that is set up in this country that does not stop punishing people after they have finished their prison sentence. There are many, many barriers to reentry in Missouri and across the country that contribute to a really high recidivism rate, where people are unable to feel successful when they return to the community and then often end up reincarcerated. So we're going to talk about one reform today that we think will help to break down that cycle that we're going to be advocating for. But first, just a couple of other statistics to give you a sense of the massive scope of the problem that we are looking at in the state of Missouri. So this data is a little outdated. This is from the Prison Policy Initiative in 2018, but the numbers haven't changed that drastically since then. So when we look at Missourians who are incarcerated, you can see that we have a large number of folks who are incarcerated in our state prisons. Some in our local jails, sort of small swaths of youth and involuntary commitments. And then we do have about 7,000 folks who are incarcerated in federal prisons. Those are outside of Missouri. Missouri only has one federal prison, and it's a special medical facility. So most Missourians who are incarcerated in federal prison are incarcerated outside of Missouri. So just a quick reminder that the prison and jail incarceration rates have been just skyrocketing since the early 90s. So you can look at the relatively low number of folks that were incarcerated in the late 70s and then see the trend lines that existed sort of over the next 40 years, and see that we have really decided to use incarceration in a way that is not really in keeping with the way the rest of the world uses incarceration. We use it to fix a lot of societal problems, rather than offering community-based solutions, including cutting down on poverty, and providing community-based solutions to drug use. We've instead decided to incarcerate people at just incredible rates in this country, and particularly in this state. And so that takes us to this graphic, which I always just find to be really shocking in thinking about our incarceration rate, not only in United States, but in Missouri, and how our rate of incarceration surpasses even that of the US, which globally is held up to be the highest incarceration rate in the world. So really, as we look at how much we are reliant on our incarceration system to deal with societal problems, we can really start to recognize that this is not the right solution, and that incarceration comes with a massive cost to individuals, to families, to taxpayers, to communities, and recognize that we have a lot of work to do to lower our incarceration rates, both in Missouri and across the country, to be much more in line with the way that incarceration is used globally. And then just one other thing to really put in perspective is to remember, and these are those same numbers in this top half of the graphic from the previous pie chart, that there are many, many more people who are under the supervision of the justice system in Missouri, other than those who are actually incarcerated in a facility. Missouri has tens of thousands of people who are currently under the supervision of the Department of Probation and Parole, and that creates many, many more issues in terms with folks needing to comply with policies that really inhibit the way that they are able to live their lives, to support their families, and that often what we find are that violations of probation and parole and those systems then end people up in the prison system itself. So just recognizing that the issue is much larger than just the people who are behind bars. So, thinking a little bit about the barriers to reentry in the state of Missouri, and how folks often are set up to really not be successful when they are returned to their communities after a prison sentence. So I'm actually going to go from the bottom up here. So there have been so many studies in this country surrounding education of those who are incarcerated and the enormous benefits that happen when folks who are incarcerated receive additional educational support. So whether that be that folks are able to get their GED so that they can have that high school equivalency, or take some classes to, get an associate's degree or another work towards another higher education. They know that then when folks come out, they have ignited a passion. They've improved their sort of job prospects because of that education, and they are much less likely to return to prison. However, the Bureau of Justice Statistics tells us that really only about a third of prisons were providing some sort of access to higher education. And so that is something that we know that there can be a lot more work done on, both while people are incarcerated and as they are coming out of incarceration. How are we providing educational supports to folks to further their education and help them to create a new career pathway for themselves? Another big issue is public housing. So most public housing authorities have these blanket screening policies that allow them to reject applicants who have any sort of criminal background. And so, or the places where folks are able to receive housing may be in really inconvenient locations, may not be good for them to be able to, keep their children in the school district that they had been enrolled in, or have them be in housing that's close to job opportunities. And so the way that we have restricted housing for folks with a criminal record is also a huge impediment to people being successful as they're coming out of the prison system. And then finally, employment. So this data is a little bit old, but I just thought this figure was really striking. So of about 250,000 offenders who came out of the federal prison system in this 4-year period, 50% of those individuals who couldn't secure employment during the time of their supervised release were ultimately sent back to prison for either committing another crime or for a violation of their probation or parole. So I think that it is just really, really important for us to be thinking about how are we ensuring that folks have access to jobs. And there are a number of reforms that have existed in this place, many of which Empower Missouri has been part of over the years. And one of those has been ban the box initiatives. So both in government as well as in some private sectors, there have been initiatives that have taken place to say, don't require people to disclose their past incarceration, their criminal records when they are applying for work. And while there are a few fields where this might be necessary for the safety of those involved, largely we have to remember again that the vast majority of those who are incarcerated on nonviolent crimes, many of them drug-related charges that in no way impede their ability to be a good employee. And that when we ask people to disclose their criminal records, what we're really doing is we're feeding into a level of stigma that many community members hold about those who have been incarcerated. So the piece of legislation that we are talking about today, HB 316, is really important in the employment space because it is going to open thousands of new job opportunities statewide for those who have a prior felony conviction on their record. So right now, because of some really nonsensical parts of the Missouri law, if you have a felony conviction on your record, you cannot work in any establishment that sells alcohol or sells lottery tickets. So if you think about where you can buy lottery tickets and alcohol, that is in a lot of places that have really good entry-level jobs. So we're talking about gas stations, we're talking about convenience stores, we're talking about grocery stores, we're talking about restaurants. And all of those places right now are under these restrictions from the supervisor of liquor control and the Missouri Gaming Commission that says if you have this type of offense on your record, you can't work in that kind of location. And so it's not only bad for individuals who are coming out of the justice system who are looking for good work in a good entry-level job that has a lot of opportunity for growth, like many of those places that I've just named. But also it's bad for employers. It really limits the pool. You know, all the time have sat in several hearings in the Committee on Small Business here in the Capitol, and they're always saying, we have such a hard time finding employees. We have such a hard time finding employees. And part of it is that people need to be paid a living wage. And that's a whole other conversation that we could get into. But also it's that they are excluding a group of folks from their employment pools because of a mistake that they have made in the past and they have already served their time for. So HB 316 is a piece of legislation sponsored by Representative Cherie Tolson Reich. She's been working on this legislation for a while. It passed out of the House last year, actually unanimously, and unfortunately just didn't make it into a Senate hearing because of COVID and the way that the COVID sort of shut down the government in Missouri for the latter half of the session. But it is back this year. And I can tell you a little bit about where it's been and where it's going. So it was pre-filed in the House on December 4th. Had its first and second readings in the first 2 days of session. Had an early public hearing on February 2nd, and was passed out of its executive session on the 9th by a unanimous vote. It went on in the Missouri House. You then have to go through to the Rules Committee. So it went and had its rules hearings, no problems, passed unanimously out of rules. And now it has been waiting for its floor hearing. We're very confident that it's going to get a floor hearing, but we are less confident that it will happen early enough to have the time that it needs to make it over to the Senate and go through the whole process on the Senate side in order to be able to pass and become law. So we are wanting to call lawmakers this week and ask them to vote yes on HB 316 and to ask them to make sure that 316 gets a hearing as soon as possible. So we are going to drop in the chat some templates for folks to go ahead and do outreach. So, you know, this year, as you've noticed, we have taken most of our advocacy online because there was a lot of concerns early in the session about COVID in the Capitol building. So while we normally would have done an advocacy day, this year we are instead encouraging people to reach out to their representatives through the many other communication channels that we have other than just coming to the Capitol. So we are providing you with templates for for email outreach, as well as a script to be able to make phone calls to your legislature, your representative's office. And then if your representative uses Twitter or Facebook, to also reach out to them online. So I am going to stop sharing for a second. I'm going to come back to this 501c3 piece and go ahead and show you this link just so everyone has access to it. So Sarah dropped it in the chat for us. Thank you, Sarah. Oh, sorry, I gotta get out of here. Too many tabs open. Okay, so if you are able to click into this Google document that Sarah dropped in the chat, what you will find is that the very first link in this document is a legislator lookup. So if you do not know who your Missouri representative is, no problem. You can really easily go into the Senate or the House. This exists on both sides, and put in their address. So I'll go ahead. I'll put in our street address here at the office in Jefferson City, just so you can see how this works. Click look up legislators, and it is going to tell me exactly who my local legislators are. So here at the office in Jeff City, we're in Senate District 6. So Senator Mike Bernskotter is our senator, and we are in House District 60. So our representative is Dave Griffith. So for today, we're going to be reaching out to folks in the House. So if I want to learn a little bit more about Dave Griffith, I can click into this, and it's going to take me directly to his legislative profile. So I can see the bills that he's sponsored. I can see his hometown, the counties he covers. I can read his bio. I can learn a lot about him just from looking at this page. But we have also put together some information that might be useful to you. So this is our Empower Missouri legislator contact information form. So I can also click into here, and I can see all of our senators and representatives. I can really easily find their email address and their phone number, as well as their Twitter handle. So their representatives can be a little bit harder to find on social media. So we have gone ahead and put together that information for you. If you are a Twitter person and want to tweet at folks, we have all of that information in here. So you are able to go through and look up the information that you might need. So then within our templates here, we have an email template for you to go ahead and do outreach. And like I said, we are prioritizing outreach to representatives since it still needs to be heard on the House floor. But if you're feeling ambitious and you want to reach out to your senator as well, there's definitely no harm in that, to get that on their radar so that when it does make it over to the Senate, they can help get a quick hearing on it. But we always want to be sure that when you're sending an email, many organizations like ours will provide an email template to you. But we want to be sure that you don't just copy and paste, but that you add in a sentence or two about why this is important to you or why you're advocating for this. Similarly, with the phone script, just be aware that when you call, you're likely not going to immediately get to talk to your representative or senator. Maybe you get lucky and they're in the office and happy to take your call, but it's much more likely that you're going to talk to their assistant. That's totally fine. Leave a detailed message. Legislative assistants do track that and make sure that representatives and senators get those messages. And we've heard that that does really matter to them in terms of looking up legislation, learning more about it, and advocating for it to happen. And then finally, we just drafted a couple of sample tweets for you to send out if you prefer to engage with folks in that way. So one last thing, and then we're gonna send you off to be able to go and do this quick outreach in our last 10 minutes. But I did just want to quickly go over, I know that we've heard from many people over time that there is some concern if you work for a 501c3 organization that maybe you shouldn't be doing any lobbying. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that. And so in 1 minute, I'm going to give you the rundown, and then I'm going to stay on the line for people who have more questions about this. So one really important thing to know is that Empower Missouri is a 501c3. We are able to do everything that we do, all of the lobbying and advocacy work that Empower Missouri does. We are doing legally under federal law. So if you think about how much you've seen Empower Missouri do advocacy work and lobbying work, know that you and your agency are maybe only going to be doing a small fraction of that. And so if what our level of doing is legal, certainly what you're wanting to do is legal. So I think that it's a really powerful misconception that exists that 501c3s and their staff are not allowed to do sort of direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. You very much can. There are two different ways that the federal government measures the amount of advocacy and lobbying work that you are doing. But even a small organization like Empower, our annual budget's about $500,000 a year. We can spend up to 20% of our time lobbying by taking the 501h election. So we're going to be doing a lot more work with organizations over the next year to help you learn more about these rules, help you to sort of understand what tracking can look like, how you can sort of make sure that you're putting the documentation in place to make you and your board feel safe. But please don't be afraid of it. Advocacy work is something that C3s absolutely can and should be doing and is well within your purview as a public organization. So I'm going to stick around for the next 15 or 20 minutes, a little bit into the 1 o'clock hour to answer questions or hear from you. So if you are willing, right now we're asking everyone to use those templates, find their legislators, do some outreach on HB 316, and then tell us what you heard back. So we'll be here to hear from you in person or drop it in the chat. And we are so grateful to you for spending this hour with us and for rounding it out by doing a little bit of outreach on your own. So I'll stick around for questions now, but if you don't have any questions, go forth and advocate. And thank you so much for joining our week of action.